This is a video about press freedom in the United States and STEM shortage claims. STEM is an acronym, STEM, for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. STEM shortage claims are claims that there's a desperate, dire shortage of STEM workers, scientists, engineers, and especially programmers or software engineers. There's different terms. They're basically people who code, who write computer code today. STEM shortage claims have been around for a long time, at least since the aftermath of World War II. So World War II was a very high-tech war with the Manhattan Project developing the atomic bomb, penicillin with the development of radar, the development of bombers like the B-29 bomber, and a variety of other high-tech things, high-tech devices and technologies. It produced, in fact, a large number of qualified technicians, engineers, and other people who were employed during the war. Despite that, the industry and academia and the government began to claim that there was a terrible shortage of engineers and other kinds of people, physicists, for example. My degree is in physics, right after the war and accelerating up through Sputnik and so on. In those days, these things focused more on aviation, on physics and rocketry, that area. Programming and computers were just getting going at that time. There had been a few computers built during the war, and they came into pretty moderate use actually in the 1950s. Today, STEM shortage claims are largely claims about software engineers, programmers, computer scientists. There's several different terms that are used, and there are claims of terrible shortages. They've been made by many employers of programmers, many high-profile figures like Bill Gates at Microsoft. They're pervasive. They are repeated in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, across the political spectrum. Almost the entire mainstream media and even other sources repeat these claims. They're very popular and well known and widely believed by many, many people. They're also not true, but that rarely gets much media coverage. Now, there are some examples of coverage of these problems in, for example, some articles by Brian Vastag at the Washington Post and a number of other people, but those are quite rare. In this, I'm going to talk about this almost seeming control of the media coverage of this issue that exists in the United States, and it's pretty much a worldwide phenomenon. One sees similar types of claims in the United Kingdom and many other countries. First of all, let me just say a little bit more before I launch into about the STEM shortage claims before I launch into a discussion of the implications for press freedom and to what extent we genuinely have a free press in the United States and even worldwide, even in other democratic countries like the European Union. So it's a big discussion, and I have other videos and articles that discuss why the STEM shortage claims are false. One rather remarkable thing is that if you look at the number of students in the United States who pass advanced placement calculus, either the AB or the BC calculus exam, this number has been going up by about 6 to 7% actually since the 1970s. I don't show the data from the 70s, but it's not a new phenomenon, and it's easily discernible in the data on the College Board website as far back as the mid-90s, and actually if you read math teaching journals and things like that, you'll find out this is true. So these are people who pass a very difficult exam, and calculus is generally treated as a precursor and requirement for most engineering, science, physics, computer science, etc. And what it shows is that in 2016, there were 280,000 students in the United States in 1 year who actually took and passed AP Calculus. And so most of these people go into fields where they do computer programming or actually take computer science courses. Probably most of these students are already programming and have been doing so for at least a few years before taking the AP Calculus exam. Now, this does not include the students who don't take calculus until college, university level, which there's a fairly large number. Already, this 280,000 per year, if you project it forward, will cover any of the projected losses, or excuse me, projected shortfalls that you'll sometimes see in STEM shortage claims. And I have a lengthy discussion here in more detail of this in this article, which I'll include in the show notes for this video. The point is, it's really not true. There isn't a shortage of scientists, engineers, etc., even if you just look at Americans and you don't consider people who are coming here under visas like the H-1B visa and other programs. So it's a remarkable disconnect. And I might add specifically, the mainstream media almost never reports this dramatic increase in the number of people taking and passing the AP Calculus exam. Instead, what they report are articles showing slight declines in the average math performance, like the math SAT, in years when it actually goes down. Sometimes it goes up, or sometimes they frequently report these obscure international comparison tests like PISA and TRIPS or TRIMS. I forgot the exact pronunciation. Even though most Americans never take these things or deal with them, they take the SAT or the College Board test, advanced placement. These things get a lot of press because they show kind of average performance. STEM workers are not average students, they're top students, and the performance of top students in the United States is actually quite good. And I could go on, and I have in other videos and other articles, but I want to talk about what this means for press freedom. We don't have laws, for the most part, that, as far as I can tell, that actually regulate what the press publishes. It's very rare for the government to try to stop publication or overtly control publication of articles in the United States. So we seemingly have a very free press, except maybe during wartime, like World War II or World War I, where there was overt censorship going on. Now, the government does have the Espionage Act, which it occasionally uses to threaten the press, and it's not clear what they can do under the Espionage Act from 1917. It's a World War I era, and it's being used, for example, against Julian Assange right now in an attempt to, I don't know what they're trying to accomplish, but the point is the Espionage Act is one of those funny things where the government could use it to lean on people to not publish certain things or talk about certain things. But in general, we seem to have a very free press, but we also have, as in the case of the STEM shortage, some remarkable unanimity across the supposed political spectrum on some topics, like the STEM shortage claims. And of course, there's all kinds of people out there complaining about supposed control of the press by the CIA or various other government agencies, corporations. It follows the political spectrum. So this is a relatively left-wing group, Project Censored, and so they're mostly griping about news media that doesn't agree with their agenda. This is a book which has articles by many different reporters describing encounters with censorship seemingly coming from a variety of sources. Let me see if I can get to the table of contents here. There we go. Okay, so these are different reporters. I'm describing some of their experiences. Christina Borgeson, who's also the editor, was trying to cover the TWA 800 crash or terrorist incident or whatever actually happened, and ran into problems and was eventually fired by CBS or forced to resign or something like that. So I don't want to get into a lot of this. I just want to say that there's a lot of these allegations. There's, of course, Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman's famous book, Manufacturing Consent. These tend to have very political bias to them. So the Chomsky is sort of left-wing. Accuracy in Media is a very right-wing group, so all of the things it complains about are, critical coverage of Trump or things like that. And this is actually, I don't know too much about this website, but it's worth noting that it sort of assumes a standard political spectrum and sort of tries to tell you these sources are supposedly biased this way or that. This book is recent. This is Hate Inc. by Matt Taibbi from Rolling Stone. He kind of makes a different argument that the media has become highly polarized for business reasons, where you have, for example, Fox News basically tells right-wing conservative people what they want to hear, and MSNBC basically tells left-wing liberal people what they want to hear. And this is actually a bad thing and is really kind of new kind of propaganda. Now, the STEM shortage claims are really across the seeming political spectrum. They are promoted on liberal, left-wing news sources, New York Times, other sources. Fox News sometimes promotes them. There's also criticism of them across the political spectrum from, right-wing sources, from labor unions, the AFL-CIO, and other people. So it's very different from the way people normally think about press censorship, alleged press censorship in the United States. And yet there's a remarkable unanimity across a very wide range of seemingly diverse, newspapers, websites, media sources. Now, this kind of thing often takes you into this sort of notion of conspiracies and conspiracy theories. You do not need a conspiracy theory, like some far-out thing like the Bavarian Illuminati, to explain this. In fact, the, quote, conspiracy, unquote, is quite open and overt. So the employers of STEM workers, and particularly programmers, I'm going to focus on programmers because that's really what it's mostly about today. That wasn't the case, 40, 50, 60 years ago, back in the Cold War and earlier times. The reality is that these employers individually lobby, and their lobbying almost always involves the STEM shortage claims and claims of problems with the K through 12, kindergarten through 12th grade education system in the United States. They rarely criticize colleges and universities, even though they hire the employees from colleges and universities. So you might think that if they're having trouble getting qualified people from the colleges and universities, they would criticize the colleges and universities and say, why don't you have your act together? Why aren't you producing, qualified people? But they don't do that. In fact, they collaborate with the universities to blame these problems on K through 12 education, especially public schools. They don't criticize private schools as much, even though many STEM workers are actually educated in private schools. Something I'm not going to go into in this video, but their focus is on the public school education system. So this is a prominent example of this kind of lobbying, which specifically promotes the STEM shortage claim. So there's actually a section here where Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook claims a shortage of qualified people, that Facebook is unable to hire people because they can't find people. It's called What Most Schools Don't Teach. It was very famous. It went sort of viral, seemingly, in 2013. It has 14 million views. Now, this comes from code.org. And again, it's a very charming website with lots of good-looking little kids. It's very diverse. We have, all sorts of different ethnic groups represented. I'm not being snarky here. What I'm pointing out is they often link all of this to racial issues, to inequality in education, and so on. They really love education and promoting this belief system, the idea that there's this STEM shortage, which, as I said, is completely contradicted by the data from the College Board. But they love to focus on children and education, and this is something everybody, right, left, center, is generally in favor of. Most of us believe in education, and whether you're talking about right-wing conservatives or left-wing liberals or whatever, now there may be disputes about what should be taught in those schools, but basically most people are in favor of children, and education is like mom and apple pie. So it's a great thing to wrap your agenda around. Well, who are these people? Well, these are the donors, 10 million plus, etc., for code.org, the organization that produced the video and many other things promoting these ideas. Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook, Infosys. These are all major employers they are major employers of STEM workers, and specifically programmers and software engineers. Infosys, it's Infosys Foundation. Infosys is actually an Indian company. Here we have 3 million more. Well, Pierre Omidyar of eBay fame, Google, Bill and Melinda Gates, still Steve Ballmer, or that's Bill Gates' successor as head of Microsoft, and we can go on. Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, that's Zuckerberg from Facebook. Reid Hoffman is LinkedIn. I'm not sure actually who the Greenbergs are. Salesforce, and we could go on and on. They're virtually all employers of either directly employers of software engineers or they're investment people. The doors are Kleiner Perkins, the venture capital firm. They're either directly employers or they're investors who are major stockholders and investors in software engineering companies or companies that employ software engineers. Another organization is Compete America, and of course it's like all who's who mostly of high-tech companies that employ engineers, STEM workers, especially software engineers. And there's also government-created reports and committees which produce promotional materials promoting these ideas. So this is specifically a famous report that came out actually in 2005. I don't know why it's dated 2007. But what they're talking about here is supposedly terrible education. It's a crisis, and it's because of it we're not getting enough high-tech people. We have this STEM shortage. That's basically what they're saying here. Who is this? Well, the people who are listed as its committee that produced it, it was probably written by like a staff, and these guys just signed off on it. But regardless of how much of a role they played in this, again, who are we talking about here? Exclusively employers of STEM workers. We don't see any examples of STEM workers. We don't have students here. We don't actually have, teachers. We don't actually have graduate students, and other people are actually representatives of the employees who are affected by this. We have Norman Augustine Lockheed, Craig Barrett, who was the head of Intel at the time, and so on. They're virtually all either government, academic, university, employers, or big companies. And that's who produces this. So very openly, these people work together to promote these ideas. They promote a collection of ideas that are stapled together. They're logically independent. And the one I'm focusing on here is the STEM shortage claims, which are factually incorrect. They're just not true. There is no shortage. There's plenty of people being produced with these kind of skills. but they keep claiming it. So what does this say about press freedom in the United States? Well, this is an example where interested parties, large corporations, academic universities, government laboratories, all working together, have been able to largely control the terms of debate across the political spectrum. They were able to get Democrats, Republicans, liberals, conservatives to buy into these beliefs, especially the idea that there's this terrible shortage. It's not magic. They have a sophisticated public relations campaign, and they use sophisticated techniques that appeal to people across the political spectrum. So who's against cute-looking kids, right? Who's going to come out against education? So these are very positive messages, and they've been very effective at linking it to diversity, to racial issues in a subtle but fairly overt way. And I'm not going to, this video is not intended to focus on the use of racial issues, but part of what they're saying is, implying is that these high-tech companies are meritocracies that hire people based on their skills, ability, intelligence, that sort of thing. Therefore, the reason they don't have all of these, diverse people is because the schools in poor areas, in areas like Washington, D.C., and Newark, New Jersey, Appalachia, other areas, they mainly focus on areas where the people are non-white, though, but Appalachia gets in there occasionally. They would hire these people. They have hired every white male they can, and they can't find enough qualified white males. So they would love to hire all these diverse people. And the only issue behind why they don't do it is these terrible schools. And it's pitched differently to different groups. So on the left, they tend to appeal to the idea that there's poor funding, even though some of these schools like in Washington, D.C. and Newark, New Jersey are actually extremely heavily funded. They're very highly funded on a per pupil basis. But they focus on, they pitch these ideas like the STEM shortage in different ways that appeal to the prejudices of different groups, and thus they're able to promote this idea across a very wide spectrum, from the pretty right-wing conservative people to pretty left-wing liberal people. And again, going back to this notion of education. Education is very popular. Learning is very popular. Everybody is in favor of knowledge. Therefore, that's a great way. And of course, most people are in favor of kids, at least claim to be in public. So what's the lesson, the larger lesson? It's hard to know if we can derive a larger lesson. I don't want to get into, conspiracy theories and overtly national security related areas where there's allegations of very powerful censorship. Some of the websites that I showed earlier that are claiming it get into these kind of areas. To some extent, the STEM shortage is usually presented as a national security issue, that we don't have enough of these people and we're getting overwhelmed by our foreign enemies. So it does overlap to some degree, but it is different. So it's difficult to extrapolate to these other areas. But what it does demonstrate is that, in some sense, the government, industry, powerful people who work together, whether they're ostensibly the government or high-tech employers in business and so on, are certainly in this case able to produce a very uniform coverage of this issue. And they don't actually do it by very covert methods as far as we can tell. Of course, there's campaign contributions, and there's a lot more to it than I've shown here. But they do it very overtly through sophisticated public relations, advertising, and other activities that empirically work in this case very well. They work very well in promoting a completely erroneous idea about the state of education and the number of people who are trained in advanced STEM subjects, and particularly in calculus. Sorry, let me just go back to the cute kids again. So I think that this is something that goes beyond the STEM shortage claims and related policies. So there's immigration and racial and other issues that are tangled up with it. In terms of demonstrating a lack of independence in the press, which, given that a lot of it's funded by advertising dollars from these companies, in fact, isn't that surprising. The lesson probably is to try to find independent sources and recognize that advertising-driven media, which is an awful lot of the media and includes like the Google search engine or Facebook, these advertising-driven media, as this case shows, are very subservient to the advertisers who pay the bills. It doesn't necessarily require the Bavarian Illuminati or strong arm tactics from the CIA or anything like that to produce this kind of unanimity in our society. So informed, if you will, information consumers need to look for and fund by buying books or other things, more independent sources that don't depend on advertising from the employers that we work for, the companies that are selling us things. These are not looking out for our interests. So we really need to look out for our interests, seek out independent sources, and we have to fund them. There's no way around it. If you're looking for something free, someone is paying for that free information. Google is free, but Google is paid for by advertisers. Facebook is free, but Facebook is paid for by advertisers. So that concludes this video. This video was produced on January 1st, 2020, New Year's Day. If you like this video, please take a moment to click like. Please click subscribe and the notification bell if you would like to receive more content from us. We welcome constructive feedback and comments. Mathematical software is developing products and services to automate data analysis, reducing the risks of costly errors and improving results. If you want to support our work, you can subscribe on our Patreon page. This is the URL for our Patreon page. Scan the QR code in the lower right corner with your smartphone to get the Patreon link. Our Patreon link is also in the show notes below.